pest controls over to Anne Marie.
Hi, it's nice to see everybody here. I'm actually going to admit people from the waiting room as for my first order of business. So thank you so much, Richard, for inviting me. Thanks to all of you for attending. It really, one of the sort of pleasures of writing a book about the United States, as opposed to in the late 20th century, as opposed to a book about Germany in the early 20th century, is I've had the opportunity to talk to so many people who either are from Co-op City or know it in this sort of intimate way. And it's really just a pleasure to get a chance to do that. So thank you so much for giving me that opportunity. I'm gonna share screen now. I'm gonna do sort of a PowerPoint to accompany the talk. Oh wait, no, that's not what I want to do. Sorry, there we go. Can everyone see the screen? I can see it on my end. I just want to make sure everyone else is. All right, awesome. So this is the cover of my book, which is indeed available in hardcover and Kindle, I believe. It's if people are interested in buying it, so it is available on Amazon and all of that. If later on people are interested in getting it from the bookseller, I actually have a discount code I can share if people want. But for now, what I wanted to just do is start off really giving you guys an overview of the themes and the narrative of the book. Normally I start kind of orienting people in space and kind of explaining where Co-op City is. I just have a feeling this is not an audience that needs that, so I will not be doing that this time. I just want to get into the story. So Co-op City is a city of superlatives, right? It's the largest Mitchell-Lama development, actually by quite a fair margin in New York State. In fact, of New York, so there's New York State Mitchell-Lama, as many of you know. There's also New York City Mitchell-Lama, of New York State Mitchell-Lama, which is the larger program. 15% of the entire program's housing stock is Co-op City. The $390 million mortgage, construction mortgage that Co-op City had, was the largest mortgage ever issued from the New York State Housing Finance Agency. Today, Co-op City is the largest naturally occurring retirement community, or NORC, in the United States. I could keep going with these, but I'll give one more kind of random one that I just find random. If they were led end to end, the piling, so Co-op City is built on top of a landfill, so there are these pilings that go all the way down to the bedrock. Those pilings, if they were laid end to end, would stretch all the way from New York to Boston and back again. So Co-op City's big, in other words. And yet at the same time, despite its size, it has largely escaped the gaze of historians. I have some suspicions about why, which I discuss in the book, and I certainly can talk here if people are interested. But I just want to note that, like, part of how I came to this project, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in a second, was that there really was so little that had been written about it. Now, about 5 years ago, Co-op City celebrated its 50th anniversary gala. Mayor Bill de Blasio came and congratulated Co-op City as a vibrant and inclusive complex, along with being a vital ally in my administration's efforts to expand access to affordable housing. Bronx Borough President Ruben Diaz described Co-op City as one of the city's true gems. Representative Elliot Engel, shortly to be no longer Representative Elliot Engel, explained that, quote, Co-op City has always been near and dear to my heart. It's important to reflect on how fortunate we are to have such a strong and thriving housing development in the Bronx. I'm proud, he said, that I lived in Co-op City, and I'm just as proud to serve the Co-op City community today. What all these figures, and there are many more, as you can sort of see here, are pointing out is what they focus on in particular is that Co-op City remains a good deal, as resident after resident told me in interviews. As the rest of New York City has become increasingly affordable, Co-op City is become even more of a bargain. You know, my mother and sister still live in Co-op, and their apartment, they pay about $1,700, including utilities, for a 3-bedroom apartment with hardwood floors, large bedrooms, closets, and air conditioning. But the celebration of Co-op City is relatively new. Here's just a sampling of quotes for over the years about Co-op City that were significantly less laudatory. There's a lot more where these came from. And you can roughly discern 3 lines of critique. 1, Co-op City was too ugly or architecturally banal. 2nd, that Co-op City was too financially irresponsible as a construction project, and that its residents were financially unrealistic. And 3rd, that Co-op City was a fundamentally racist project that contributed to the decline of the Bronx in the 1960s and 1970s. As I discuss in the book, all 3 of these critiques don't come from nowhere. There's reasons why they come into being, and I can talk about that as people are interested, but they don't tell anything like the full story of the development. I come here to talk to you, neither to bury Co-op City, nor really necessarily to praise it. Instead, I want to talk about the outlines of my book, as I said, and then which really starts with the planning process in the early mid 1960s, and then goes all the way up to the about the 25th anniversary of the development in the early 1990s. So, to explain how I got to this project, I just wanted to say a couple things. This is a relatively, I think, typical Co-op City apartment from 1981. And actually, that's me over there. This is much of my extended family, all of whom lived in Co-op City, as did I. This was my cousin's bar mitzvah. These are all Jews, which is what I'll talk about shortly. Co-op City in its early years was very Jewish, and many of these people had moved in when Co-op City was first founded. Now, I did not ever think growing up that I would write a book on Co-op City. I'll be clear. I in fact spent most of my childhood not wanting to be in Co-op City. I think I was a pretty restless kid, and I got really as far as Berlin. I became a German historian. My first book, as I mentioned, and as Richard mentioned earlier, is a book about German history. I lived in Berlin for a number of years as I was working on that. And when I would try and describe where I was from to people who knew what New York City was, but certainly had never been to Co-op City, I found myself comparing it to this development in the north. Well, Co-op City is in the northeast of New York. Marzahn is in the northeast of Berlin. And as you can tell from these pictures, they at least look somewhat similar. Well, that interest in understanding why these 2 developments looked kind of similar led me then to kind of start wondering, well, why was that? Like, was there a sort of shared architectural story here? And so I did a fair amount of research just on urban planning in the late 20th century, and sort of came to an understanding of some of what explained some of these similarities. And that's something, again, I'm happy to talk about in the comments if people are interested, but also is something I do discuss in the book and in other publications. But as I was doing this research, I started also wondering about the community that lived in Co-op City. I really knew nothing about its history, despite, as I said, having grown up there, despite the fact that large swath, basically my mother's entire family had grown up, it had been living there, since it was founded. And it was a sort of fascinating story, what I was learning. And yet I was frustrated because I couldn't find any work by historians that really dealt with Co-op City in any depth. The few mentions that you would see in general histories, even of the cooperative movement or of tenant movement or all sorts of different things, I knew just, even just on a surface level were simplistic or in some cases just wrong. And so I started doing that research myself. So now I'll talk about some of what I found. This is a picture of Co-op City's groundbreaking ceremony. This takes place in 1966. Ground was actually broken in 1965, but sort of the ceremonial groundbreaking. And it tells us a lot about the who built Co-op City and even a little bit about why. The people who constructed Co-op City were the United Housing Foundation, which was a cooperative housing developer. In fact, it was the largest cooperative housing developer that received Mitchell-Lama funding. It developed out of the cooperative housing movement, which is a really interesting movement in some ways. On the one hand, some of their language it almost sounds like you're talking about, like this kind of quasi-utopian vision of a, socialist future. But at the same time, these are people that were very comfortable and skilled at working with administrators or sort of state officials. In fact, if you look at these pictures, the smiling person in the middle, this is Governor Rockefeller. The Co-op City primarily was working with state officials because it was a state constructed thing, but even Lyndon Johnson sends in a congratulatory telegram from Washington. In many ways, Co-op City was seen by many officials in 1965 as a potential path for large scale affordable housing. In fact, the United Housing Foundation had been constructing larger and larger developments since it had been founded in the early 1950s. Co-op City was its largest and last development. Now, the United Housing Foundation was interested in Co-op City. You can see a couple things here. So first of all, there are union officials here. There's Rockefeller. There's UHF officials, and then you also have this group of children in the front. And these children, one of the is like they're very carefully chosen, right? It's a very carefully chosen, like multicultural vision of what Co-op City is going to be. And it tells us a little bit about the priorities of the developers. In fact, I want to talk a little bit more about that before we go on further. So Co-op City, as the name implies, was a cooperative housing development. To be clear, what kind of cooperatives? There's a number of different kinds of cooperatives. Co-op City is what's called a limited equity cooperative. Essentially, people buy in with a certain amount of money. It's called equity deposit. It's now fully financeable. It was less clear how that worked in it was not always financed, although there were some backdoor ways to do it in the 60s. And then you paid a low monthly carrying charge. And these carrying charges would cover operating expenses, management expenses, and then also paying off the mortgage of the cooperative. And then when people left, they would get back an equity, the equivalent equity deposit at the time that they left, but they wouldn't realize profit on the sale, or for that matter, loss. Now, in Co-op City, the UHF was interested in creating a kind of community, as I said. They believed that residents needed to learn how to be in the right kind of cooperative behavior. In fact, they were afraid that people would just merely reproduce the kind of landlord-tenant mentality. They talk about this all the time, like tenant mentality, from places that they had lived before. So this is an orientation meeting for new Co-op City residents. These meetings were held mostly in 1965, 66. They kind of peter out after that. But there's all sorts of handbooks and other publications and discussion about how to get people to behave in cooperative ways. This vision of appropriate socialization or appropriate cooperative behavior also extended to the economic sphere. Jacob Petoskey, the president of Amalgamated Bank, which is still in Co-op City, my mother still banks there, which worked closely with the UHF, explained that the resident of Co-op City should, quote, buy in our cooperative food stores. He buys his furniture in a cooperative furniture store. He buys his cosmetics and drugs in a cooperative drugstore. He opens his account in the Amalgamated Bank, which is union owned. We have our own insurance company, et cetera, et cetera. This idea was that, Co-op City was a large enough place that you could create cooperative institutions that would enable it to exist almost not quite self-contained, but with some element of that. Now, the UHF was invested in a community that was simultaneously diverse and homogenous. With the diversity they were most interested in was diversity of age diversity. Co-op City always attracted older residents, really from the very beginning. And it's some of that had to do with the financing structure. I mean, older residents were more likely to have the money for an equity deposit, but also want low monthly ongoing charges with utilities included. And so they advertise quite heavily for young people. This ad is kind of we may have seen it before. It's pretty kind of famous Co-op City ad. It's called A Young Family's World. Another diversity that Co-op City officials were interested in, albeit in a somewhat conflicted way, as we can talk about, was racial diversity. The UHF officials repeatedly stressed that Co-op City was a, quote, open city, and there were no explicit restrictions against white families moving in. In fact, you know, there was this idea that they would, the city push them to, you know, advertise in the Black press at the time and the Spanish-speaking press, and they did it without really much pushback. Where they did push back, however, where UHF officials really did push back was in terms of money. Co-op City apartments, as I said before, were open to anybody, regardless of race, job, or current living situation, provided they could pay what was at the origin a 450-room equity deposit and also meet Mitchell-Lama income guidelines. This deposit was prohibitive for poor people, poor families, and the city pushed to drop it so that they basically saw Co-op City as potentially affordable housing, and they wanted it to serve a wider economic range of people that could live there. And the UHF absolutely refused to do that. They were less interested in affordable housing per se than in creating a cooperative community in which ownership was the bedrock. It should be affordable. They didn't want it open to, they didn't want to just be constructing housing for the very rich, but they saw ownership as central to the kind of community they wanted to produce. Now, Co-op City residents first moved in December of 1968, and it was fully constructed and occupied by 1972. Now, with the exception actually of the part of the educational park. In any event, in all 5 sections, both the high-rise and townhouse buildings, so there's 35 high-rise buildings throughout Co-op City. There are 7 townhouse clusters. They all, both of these led directly to cul-de-sac interior streets, creating a development that was easily walkable. I mean, there are, obviously you can drive in Co-op City, as all of you I'm sure know, but it's also very walkable. There's a lot of paths where you can just get most places without having to cross, or many places without having to cross a street. It was also disorienting for many visitors and new residents who found themselves surrounded by seemingly identical towers and slabs. To provide a sense of orientation, the street names for each of the 5 sections begins with a different letter, and the streets themselves were named for a variety of writers, scientists, and socialists. Section 1, for example, the first section occupied, unsurprisingly, featured Dreiser Loop for the novel, Theodore Dreiser, Debs Place for the socialist politician, De Kruif Place for the scientist, Defoe Place for the author, Darrow Place for the lawyer, and Donizetti Place for the composer. These names displayed the values of the UHF. They were aspirational, and while they were largely, but not exclusively American, they were otherwise unconnected to any one place or one history. Insofar as the very definition of utopia is derived from the Greek word for no place, these names were utopian, and they conveyed the UHF belief that their cooperative stood for progress, scientific, social, cultural, and political. Co-op City's apartments only, the apartment buildings only occupied 15% of the land area of the development. The rest of the space was utilized by a variety of establishments, for example, 3 community centers. This is before Bay Plaza, obviously, which featured a variety of goods and services, including both commercial and non-commercial spaces. There were cooperative supermarkets, cooperative pharmacy, an optical store, all these things I talked about earlier, as well as stores that were not cooperative in nature. There was, each of the community centers had 50 rooms for community meetings, which were leased to clubs, educational groups, and voluntary associations. They also provided a location for religious communities, including synagogues and churches, and for cooperative administrative offices. The high-rise towers provide community facilities as well, including medical offices, a cooperative nursery, etc. The development had its own fire station. It had 8 6-story garages, an educational park here, along with another elementary school over there. And the remaining land was used for parks, including the Central Greenway, sports facilities, gardens, bike paths, and playgrounds. The UHF officially refused to publish demographic statistics of the residents of Co-op City. However, it's possible to piece together some information about the people who initially moved there. Throughout this period, the UHF, as I mentioned before, fought really to keep the development exclusively what they called people of moderate means. So these are people that are largely somewhere between working class and the lower middle class. In fact, in part because the requirements of Mitchell-Lama regulated the maximum allowable income, and then the requirement for the equity deposit kind of acted as a sort of lower bound. And so while basically the mean total income of Co-op City residents at first occupancy was $8,325. The median was $8,500, which was almost identical to the borough as a whole at that point. In fact, if you look, Co-op City's median income has tracked, if you look at census statistics, has tracked almost identically the median income nationally since its founding. Now, the majority of those at the bottom of the income bracket were retirees who were eligible to receive a carrying charge subsidy from the state. The most common professions included office workers, federal, state, and city employees, pharmacists, garment workers, and accountants, with a smattering of physicians and lawyers at the top income rung. Upwards of 70% of Co-op City's initial residents were Jewish. In fact, Co-op City's Jewish population alone placed it within the ranks of some of the largest Jewish cities in the United States and the world. According to a sociologist who did some work on this in the early 70s, there were only 12 cities in the United States that had more Jews than Co-op City in the early 70s. Meanwhile, Co-op City was one of the top 25 Jewish cities in the entire world. Now, while Co-op City's Jewish population was double the percentage of Jews in the Bronx, it was not quite the white Jewish enclave that the Lindsay administration had initially feared. As word spread, Co-op City's applicant pool got more and more diverse. Remember, Co-op City's big. It has, over 13,000 apartments. And the original people that lived there were the original people that, lived in many of the UHF developments, which tended to attract a sort of union-oriented Jewish white base. That's who they were, the leaders of the UHF, and that's much of who their clientele was. But over time, you saw larger numbers of non-white applicants. Later sections would have a larger percentage of Black and Hispanic residents, especially Section 5, which was the last section to be occupied. By the time Co-op City opened, approximately 25% of residents were either were white, or so about 25% were either Black or Latino, mostly Puerto Rican. According to census statistics, New York in 1970 was New York City was about 76% white, and the non-Hispanic population was estimated around 64%. So in other words, Co-op City was only really slightly more white than the city as a whole. Just as the UHF has insisted, these Black and Hispanic residents were drawn from the same middle-class demographics as their white neighbors. And mostly they moved to Co-op City for the same reasons, namely the desire to escape what they saw as deteriorating neighborhoods. As the future Supreme Court Justice Sonia Sotomayor wrote, quote, her family moved to Co-op City in 1970 when she was a teenager because, quote, my mother was eager to get us into a safer place because the Bronxdale projects were headed downhill fast. Home was starting to look, she said, like a war zone. New residents exulted in their apartments. One recalled, quote, I never remember being so excited about anything. We hadn't seen the apartment until we walked in and we ran around exploring every nook and corner of the beautiful. I think someone has their mic on. Oh, sorry. Okay. I saw just a question in the chat about Robert Moses. Robert Moses was at the groundbreaking. He or sent a speech. I'm sure he attended. In any event, he did have a speech at the groundbreaking, but he was less involved with this project than in earlier UHF projects. But I can talk about that more in the Q&A. In any event, although Co-op City's early residents were drawn almost exclusively from the left of the political spectrum, as was common in other UHF buildings, Creature comforts and safety far outweighed the ideological appeal of the UHF's cooperative vision. The UHF was largely undisturbed by this and believed that Co-op City was evidence of a cooperative dream come true. This guy, Harold Liebman, who ran the initial orientation meetings for Co-op City applicants, exulted, quote, "After nearly 3 years of meeting with thousands of applicants, I walked into a living, throbbing beehive of humanity. Grandparents relaxing on benches, young mothers shushing baby carriages, and oceans of children in and out of camp, scampering in every cool nook and cranny. These children are completely unconscious of color or any other adult-oriented distinctions that are the bane of our society everywhere, except in co-op communities." Optimism about Co-op City's future was shared by residents, which served to allow the community to weather generational stresses and racial ones, which were often intertwined since younger families were more likely to be diverse for a number of reasons, and I can talk about those later. The relative class homogeneity helped integration as well. As Reggie, a Black resident, said, quote, I didn't know anyone who was on welfare or Section 8. Everyone seemed to be working hard and instilling values in their kids. Everyone was seeking a utopia. We were all haves, not have-nots. But there was one tension that such good feelings could not overcome: financial. Now, this is a picture I just kind of want to point out. I kind of love this because I saw this a million times before I figured out what was actually going on. So this is a promotional photo for the Co-op City Times, which was run by the United Housing Foundation. So it's, two boys standing in front of a wall reading the Co-op City Times. But if you look more closely, you can see the title of the article they're reading, which is basically talking about carrying charge increases and whether or not they could avoid them. So carrying charges increased basically in 1970, 71. These are the monthly charges that residents pay, 73 and 74, with an additional 25% increase planned for mid-1975. In other words, over a 10-year period from the time Co-op City was initially proposed, costs went up 250% per room. UHF officials and residents were both appalled by this rise, but the UHF was never going to challenge the state particularly aggressively. They lobbied, but that's where it ended. In the end, they believed that residents needed to pay. They saw these reasons for carrying charge increases, inflation, rising interest rates, the need to occupy buildings quickly as natural. They did not acknowledge two things, though. One were the artificially low estimates that UHF officials later would admit to submitting to be able to get their projects approved. And then finally, corruption. Now, corruption is always a tricky thing to find as a historian. And so while I know that there was some corruption, I don't know quite the extent of it. But what was clear was that the environment in which Co-op City was constructed was sort of tailor-made for such issues. One of the things is that oversight happened through the state, but the state official in charge of oversight was a former UHF official. And many Mitchell-Lama developments, including, I could mention, Trump Village, were, investigated for corruption. Co-op City was corrupt. It was not disproportionately corrupt, is actually my sense of this period, for what it's worth. In any event, all of these factors contributed to this rise of carrying charges. And whereas UHF officials were kind of, believed that they should agitate against it, but ultimately it was their responsibility to pay, residents were not so easily assuaged. They felt that they had been hoodwinked, duped into buying into an affordable development that was no longer affordable. And increasingly, they began demanding a rent strike. A rent strike was nothing new or invented by Co-op City residents. In fact, Co-op City residents never really technically were doing a rent strike because they weren't paying rent. They were paying carrying charges. It was actually a carrying charge strike. But what the idea of a rent strike had arisen basically in the same leftist Jewish milieu that birthed the United Housing Foundation to begin with. And was used on, in sort of tenements on the Lower East Side, and really then became a tactic of tenants in New York, really throughout the 20th century. And there's been obviously some resurgence of that now. In any event, The leader of the rent strike was a young union printer named Charles Rosen. This is him right here. Still lives in Co-op City, actually still my mother's neighbor. Now, the rent strike might well have happened without Rosen. Residents have been talking about a potential rent strike for years, but by the force of his personality, the attention he paid to organizing, and the nature of his critique, Rosen would put his indelible stamp on it. When Rosen assumed control of SC3, he was 31 years old. So SC3 is the group in Co-op City that leads the rent strike. He was at 31 years old, a generation younger than many of the leaders of Co-op City politics. He was the son of immigrant Jews who had become communist activists during the Depression. And Rosen was a true believer. He visited the Soviet Union. He met with Khrushchev. In the early 1970s, he switched his affiliation to the Maoist Progressive Labor Party and actually met his wife at a Progressive Labor Party meeting. Taking a step back from activism, Rosen became a union printer working at the New York Post. And in 1970, he and his wife moved to Co-op City because, like so many residents, they wanted, quote, stable rents and a decent integrated environment to raise their children. Once there, Rosen did not avoid politics for long. He first became chairman of the Building 22 Association. Every building had its own association, and then became involved in rent strike politics. The rent strike that he would lead would become the largest rent strike in American history. Now, Rosen brought his experience and perspective from years of left-wing organizing to Co-op City. And the fact is, he was very open about the fact that he was very far to the left. In fact, according to one SC3 leader and trade union organizer, quote, when Rosen proved his leadership ability, they had no problem with his politics. I don't know, maybe in Co-op City, except Maoists more readily than Stalinists nowadays. I always find that kind of great quote. In any event, Rosen was charismatic and drew people to his vision of a powerful organization led by residents to represent residents that would combat what he saw as a dangerous alliance of the state, the United Housing Foundation, and banks that was oppressing Co-op City and middle-class men and women across America. What his argument was for how the rent strike would work and why it would win relate on the particular financial structure of Co-op City. As I mentioned before, Co-op City had a mortgage, right? That was guaranteed by the state. But it was guaranteed, what the state did, how the state raised money, the construction funds initially, was not like pure state expenditures, it was through bonds. These the United Housing the State Housing Finance Agency sold bonds to banks. And essentially, Rosen's critique was that he was saying that the Housing Finance Agency was beholden to these banks, not to the residents. It was demanding carrying charge increases because this is what the banks wanted. They wanted their money. As one of Rosen's allies later explained, New York State could not exist unless it sold bonds. That's the way you stay in business. They sell bonds for everything, for road construction, for colleges, for hospitals, for universities. It's the way they do everything in New York State, by selling bonds. The Housing Finance Agency was a leg of that table. What happened, these bonds weren't sold to ordinary people. They were sold to stock companies, corporations. The state was going to default if Co-op City residents went on strike. And that was the basic reason that they really gave in, because we had the money. They could put us in jail. They could close our accounts, but they're not getting the carrying charge money. The rent strike started in June of 75 and lasted until July of 76. There's no hard data, but it's generally accepted that at least 75% and probably higher took part in the rent strike, withholding checks from the state. As soon as the rent strike started, the UHF's board would resign. And while it would limp along for another few decades, it would never build new housing today. Now, what indeed Rosen predicted, in a sense, is why the state caved in. Co-op City's $390 million mortgage represented over a third of the Housing Finance Agency's entire portfolio of $1.1 billion in bonds. Now, originally, the executive director of the HFA tries to protect confidence. However, in internal memos, HFA officials recognized that they would struggle to find buyers for bonds for new construction and to even pay off their existing debts. This is happening if you think about the time period, from the summer of 75 until the summer of 76, exactly overlaps with the time period of New York City's near bankruptcy. I can talk about that interaction more in the comments, but one of the things that it made the case was that it drove up interest rates even higher. It made it even higher to find new buyers for debt. And the New York State Housing Finance Agency several times was teetering on the edge of insolvency itself. Now, it does give in. In the end, the state capitulated with the end of the rent strike coming in July 76. And the plan that would end the rent strike would allow residents to take control of the development. Hailing the rent strike, Bienvenida Quintana, a resident in building 15, said, quote, "At least it gives our community an opportunity to find out by ourselves if the state's demands were legitimate." Excuse me, since Co-op City is to be operated and run by cooperators, it will now be a true cooperative. The end of the rent strike would not bring the utopia that Quintana and others may have hoped for. Unable to find enough savings or new income, the new resident directors of Co-op City, including Charlie Rosen, would be forced to approve carrying charge increases in 1977, an anonymous end to a rent strike with the slogan, "No way, we won't pay." The state was generally unwilling to negotiate further. And with Co-op City resident hands who were loath to carry out another rent strike, they didn't really have to. The state would push through additional carrying charge increases in the late 70s and early 80s. Meanwhile, Co-op City would change a lot in this period. So, and I think demographically, and I think this picture is actually kind of indicative, in addition to being my nursery school picture. What you can tell is the two adults here are white, but the children here are increasingly diverse, right? White children no longer make up the majority. And one of the things that happened is Co-op City goes from being, as we talked about before, a largely Jewish and largely white community to one that is much more mixed, and ultimately now is mostly Black and Hispanic. And that change, the bulk of that change is really happening starting in the late 70s through the 1980s. And one of the things, as Co-op City is changing demographically, it remains, as I've said before, very much, economically still in the same thing of lower middle class to working class. Residents still at the median of, national incomes, et cetera, et cetera. However, there were these fears among many residents, white, Black, and Hispanic alike, that the departure of white residents would ultimately lead to the economic decline of the community. And of course, as I said, it's like the dog that doesn't bark. It doesn't actually happen. But there were definitely these fears in the 1980s. In fact, there were all sorts of fears in the 1980s. These are just a bunch of headlines from Co-op City Times and Co-op News or City News articles. And a lot of these concerns in the 1980s focused on two things: crumbling infrastructure and rising crime. Construction defects have been found in Co-op City as early as the early 1970s. I have some good stories about that if anyone's interested, but they become increasingly apparent and problematic in the 80s, including the need to basically replace the entire plumbing system. Hundreds of millions of dollars in costs, many of which, and then all sorts of incredibly egregious corruption. This sense of literally Co-op City was a construction zone, and this fear that there would be even more construction defects found is one of the sort of drumbeats in the back of Co-op City politics throughout the 1980s. And I can talk more, people are interested in how these were paid for and sort of how that all worked. At the same time, the other fear was about rising crime. Now, statistical evidence confirms that Co-op City became more dangerous in the 1980s. Co-op City accounted at the time for about 56% of the population of the 45th precinct. In 1990, There were 4,700 major crimes reported in that precinct, whereas the two neighboring precincts had even more, 6,000 and 7,000 respectively. In other words, in 1990, the 45th precinct's crime rate was still lower than its neighbors. However, Co-op City had been one of the safest. In fact, the 45th precinct had been the quietest precinct in New York in the early 1970s, and that was no longer the case. Now, this rise in crime was indeed happening, as I said, but it was less important than the fears about high crime. From its inception, Co-op City has always been defined by a certain paradox. On the one hand, residents celebrated the community's racial integration, but on the other, racially inflected fears about crime and neighborhood decline were part of the community from its very first days. Neither of these things changed as Co-op City became a majority non-white community. In fact, while Co-op City experienced a racial transition in these years, the basic anxiety that neighborhood deterioration was an ever-present threat, and the usually unspoken assumption that such deterioration was caused by the growth of the neighborhood's Black population was an unfortunate continuity. Calls for greater police presence, especially in the 1980s, were the flip side of celebrations of racial harmony, in both cases motivated by the anxiety that a Black Co-op City would become a slum, and a belief that this fate could only be avoided by the hard work of residents to maintain the neighborhood's character as an integrated middle-class community. While Co-op City's anxieties about crime were inescapably connected with racism, fears about crime and causes for vigorous efforts to combat it were not limited to white residents. Local Black politicians were equally vociferous in articulating their fears and demanding police protection. After the 1992 murder of Gary Gonzalez in Section 5, River Bay director Harriet Jeffries, who was herself Black, spoke in an impassioned community meeting. How many children must flee school at recess to protect life and limb? How many seniors must be robbed? How many of our children must dodge bullets? How many of our children must die before we become human beings? As she concluded, the audience of 600 cooperators chanted, "Give us more cops." As a result of both the sense that the neighborhood was declining and also that it was literally falling apart, by the early 1990s, Co-op City faced a serious vacancy crisis. By 1993, 1,500 apartments stood empty, approximately 10% of the development. For a community reliant upon the income from resident carrying charges, Co-op City's vacancy problem was an existential crisis. By the new century, but the thing is, what was going on is by the new century, rising prices would put homeownership out of reach for all but the wealthiest New Yorkers. The popularity of Mitchell-Lama limited equity cooperatives like Co-op City would rise in response. But in the 80s and 90s, Co-op City was caught in a period where homeownership had become more popular among middle-class New Yorkers, while the city was still affordable enough to make owning a home or apartment a real possibility for them. The affordability and desirability of homeownership in the city and its surrounding suburbs led it to direct competition with Co-op City and other limited equity cooperatives. In 1990, the average Co-op New York City home still cost less than $200,000, and homes in the New York City suburbs that Co-op City residents favored were similarly priced. And yet at the same time, in the early 1990s, the average equity deposit required to move into Co-op City was approximately $14,000. As Myron Holtz, the deputy commissioner of the state DHCR, which basically administered Co-op City, explained, families with $14,000 prefer to use it as a down payment. It's a struggle for Co-op City. Now, through the 1980s, the state and city had become increasingly conciliatory in their dealings with Co-op City. Part of this was due to a greater ideological pragmatism. Some of it was about the firmer financial footing both the city and state found themselves due to the 1980s economic recovery. And part of it was that New York was becoming increasingly affordable and unaffordable, and affordable housing seemed more precious. So they worked with the leadership of Co-op City to keep the development affordable. In 1992, River Bay, the resident managing corporation and the state slashed the per room equity deposit and arranged for low-cost loans to new residents to finance up to 100% of their equity deposits. In doing so, they tacitly admitted that Co-op City was competing for renters and not for people who could otherwise afford to own a home. At the same time, Co-op City began to advertise aggressively for new residents. Tired of paying rent to a landlord you can never see or talk to, one ad announced? It's time to join the thousands of families who are their own landlords in Co-op City. For those who purchased 3-bedroom units, Co-op City offered a credit for the first month's carrying charges, as well as a $389.70 housewarming gift certificate towards the purchase of a refrigerator. By 95, Co-op City had arrested the rise of vacancies and had the lowest number in over a decade. Now, since then, Co-op City's carrying charges have barely kept up with inflation, and it's become, again, albeit in an entirely transformed guise in some ways, the integrated affordable community that its original founders had promised. As Kevin Clark, one of the children holding a shovel in the groundbreaking ceremony I showed you earlier on, would say at the 50th anniversary gala, quote, "Here we are, a half century, 50 years later, and Co-op City is still standing. This milestone squashes all rumors of our impermanence. We have not sunk into the marsh once home to the Freedomland amusement park. We're still standing and we're still strong." Thank you.
Excellent job. Thank you, Anne Marie. I know I have some questions, but does anybody else who's in the audience? Good crowd today. I'll assume a lot of audience members are from Co-op City itself. So if you do have any questions, please, by all means, you could just unmute and ask a question of Anne Marie. So. Okay, so maybe I'll get some questions going.
Sure.
I know you said that they were interested in age diversity.
Mm-hmm.
And having a good proportion of people who were older, or I would guess, I was just assuming getting older. I'm thinking the World War II generation, was that what they were preparing for the influx of that generation getting older? And
so they're actually even, so let's start with, so Co-op City, in some ways, the appeal of Co-op City to older people was baked in in several respects. The first, as I said already, is the financing structure. Older people are more likely to have the savings to be able to pay for an equity deposit, but also really appreciate the fact that it was cheap to live there on an ongoing basis. The stability was also important. Also, as younger families had started to move out, so a lot of the families that, younger families that tended to be more mobile, a lot of the neighborhoods that people were coming from to Co-op City were neighborhoods that people perceived, the people that would move to Co-op, as being in decline in some ways. Crime was rising, and indeed there's statistics, crime was rising. They were getting poorer, whatever. And so they were attracted. So this was something that they could actually afford, as opposed to moving out to buy a house in the suburbs or something like that. The other thing that also attracted older people is the fact that most of or not all of so there's some apartments that have stairs. Unfortunately, my mother lives in one of them, but for the most part, they're one-floor apartments. People were either, in an A apartment in a townhouse, or they were just on a floor in a high-rise building. So it's actually not a bad place to sort of age in place. And so one of the things that you wound up seeing was like that it was and at this point, we're talking about even earlier than the World War II generation. In some cases, these are people, there are definitely people who, were themselves, and you see this in the early, press in Co-op City, were themselves immigrants. There's Yiddish language stuff in the newspaper pretty regularly in the early 1970s. People who immigrated to the United States, lived on the Lower East Side, moved to the West Bronx neighborhoods around the concourse, and then moved to Co-op City. So those are the original old people. But some of the factors I'm explain why Co-op City has continued to be attractive to old people, to an older demographic ever since that. Now, the people that were running Co-op City, they recognized this appeal. They could see who was trying to get into these buildings, and they weren't against letting those people move in, but they wanted it. What they were having a harder time attracting, and therefore what they were trying to attract more of, were younger families. They saw these as the future of the development. And also they had all these big apartments. They had like a whole school system in there. And then it turned out that the schools were never, like, the capacity was always higher than the residents of Co-op City, because they were hopeful to have the mix. They kept talking about how they didn't want to be, basically just a retirement community. And they really, I don't think necessarily just wanted to be for younger residents. What they were looking for was what their definition of a vibrant, inclusive community included people across, like grandparents, parents, and children.
Great. I noticed also too, in one of the photos, he spoke about Charles Rosa when he was leading the carrying charges strike, not the rent strike. In one of the photos and from the newspapers, I noticed that there was a Michael Rosen. I guess they're related in that.
I don't actually know if they're related. To be honest, I have not thought about that. I will check that out and see. I mean, could be. I mean, certainly that's a very common name. On the other hand, yeah, totally could be.
Yeah.
I don't think there was. Michael was so one of the things to note too about that particular image is it wasn't just, so that was actually from a rally that was not just residents of Co-op City. It was also, Co-op City became a rallying cry for tenant organizers and cooperative organizers across New York. And this was a sort of big Mitchell-Lama demonstration. So it was people, they were busing in people from all over the city to co-op for this.
There's some questions in the chat.
Yeah.
So if you want to address some of those, that'd be good.
Sure. Okay. So first one, the 8,000 median, that is indeed annual income. It's the early 70s. Annual incomes were lower. I should check and see what that is in today's figure. Someone else can check that too. I just don't remember, but it's, it's a middle class, lower middle class income. What happened to Freedomland? Here, let me just say something about it very quickly. So Freedomland is the amusement park that was on, the grounds of part of where Co-op City is today. Now, I called the book Freedomland because I just thought it was kind of an interesting thing. It was like, this amusement park ultimately closed. And then here you have this, development that in some ways also is a very different vision of freedom, but like there's often this discussion of kind of freedom especially in the early sort of more utopian days. What I did not realize was that there would be so many people, and I really was not that interested in the amusement park, to be honest. I feel like I shouldn't admit it, but I will. But like, so Freedomland, so as far as I know, Freedomland closed, and in fact, I've seen this, the sort of, there is a whole conspiracy theory about the closure of Co-op City or of Freedomland. I have not seen any evidence of that in the archives, but I'm not saying it's not true. It closes because of, low visitor figures, at least as far as I know. Again, I know other people have other theories on this. And then the parcel of land, essentially, the developer of Freedomland had, in trying to pay debts, like a certain amount of the land reverts to the Teamsters. And so now they're stuck with owning land they don't necessarily really want in the Northeast Bronx. And essentially this is the role of Robert Moses, which someone asked about earlier. Robert Moses later on would be referred to as almost the marriage broker who brought together the Teamsters and the United Housing Foundation, who up until this point had been planning to build on the Lower East Side. They couldn't build on the Lower East Side because basically there was too much community outrage about it. And so this was this like huge open space. There aren't a lot of huge open spaces, in New York ever, but certainly not then. And it was basically offered to them for very cheap as a space to build. So that's not if you want, there are histories of Freedomland that are available if you want to know more about the amusement park itself. And I would definitely encourage you, if you're interested, check that. There's also like great videos on YouTube, if anyone see them, of like the ads from the original Freedomland and stuff. It's like pretty awesome. Okay.
Yeah, Mike Virgintino is one of the experts on Freedomland. We had him here a couple of times. I think he mentioned also too that they were attempting to try and see in terms of building some of the structures of Freedomland, that they used pilings to see if they would sustain themselves And if they did, then that would be sort of the precursor to some larger, bigger development. I know you remember mentioning too that obviously the development of Disneyland and then California, I think, and then Disney or Disney World. I get them confused. Disney World, Disneyland. One of them was beginning to emerge, and that was kind of like really put an end to it. So,
yeah, I mean, I think that like, you know, one thing I will say just quickly, you mentioned pilings that, you know, even when they were building, one of the things the United Housing Foundation themselves never really did, and that turned out to be a real problem, is they never consulted with an engineer who was used to building on like it was a huge landfill, right, on top of the swamp. This is very tricky conditions to build on, and they never really consulted with anybody. Ironically, what Freedomland occupied was this part of the parcel of land that ultimately, you know, became Co-op City. The part that Freedomland was on, which was not the entire space, was actually the part which had more bedrock in it. It was the most sort of stable part of Co-op City later on. Okay. But yes, Michael Verdicino is definitely like, you know, the expert on Freedomland itself. So, you know, I encourage you to read his work if you haven't already. Okay. So the controversial planning process, Dorothy, this is where the book started. So thank you for asking this question. Okay. I'll do the short version of that now, but like there's an entire chapter of the book devoted to this. So I will try not to reproduce all of it. But so Co-op City, you know, it is built at a time of great change in American urban planning philosophy, especially in New York City itself. So in the you may have heard of the term urban renewal, which is often referred to. Co-op City is not an urban renewal project, but it's similar in some respects. So urban renewal is basically this idea, Robert Moses is very much the sort of face of this, that you would demolish older buildings, older like slums in particular, and then build kind of the new city on top of that. In particular, you would have these large high-rise buildings that would accommodate, you know, lots of people. They get access to like light, air, and sun, their new nice apartments or whatever in these, and rather than in these sort of like what they saw as like these old decrepit, you know, tenement buildings. Now, this is an idea that has certain affinities with the sort of European philosophies of people like Corbusier is probably most famous, but other European modernists, although the UHF was never explicitly like they didn't like that sort of utopianism. But what they did like was that build large buildings you can build fast. And they were very disdainful of older tenements. They saw them as incubators of disease, disorder, crime, etc. Okay. Is starting in the 1960s. So some of you may have heard of Jane Jacobs, who is this resident of Greenwich Village and an urban thinker herself. And she started extolling, she wasn't the only one, but she becomes the face of it in New York. The virtues of older neighborhoods, basically saying there's an authenticity to social interactions, to the spontaneous sort of, you know, what she refers to as the sidewalk ballet of people, you know, and that you can't create that of whole cloth. That large buildings, large developments that are entirely new are soulless compared to the soul in older neighborhoods, even older slum, you know, quote unquote slum neighborhoods. Now, Jacobs starts to see her first and her kind of acolytes is quite a word, but people were influenced by her philosophy. Start to see their first political gains, really, they in the early 1960s. And they push back against, for example, Moses's plans for a lower Manhattan expressway that would have gone through Greenwich Village and, you know, whatever, through lower Manhattan. And then they see Co-op City as exactly this old thing that they're fighting against. It is this vision. It's banal. It's these huge soulless buildings, et cetera, that there wouldn't be enough places for people to, there wouldn't be enough stores, that, you know, that it would essentially, the argument that gets made by architectural critics in the late 1960s is an argument largely that what you would be creating is a soulless space with no community. That you just could not have a true authentic community in you know, a space that looks like Co-op City, that's built like Co-op City. And that turned out actually to be like, as some critics admitted, quite quickly, really false. I mean, the fact was Co-op City was a community from the time it was built. I mean, anytime you put people together, there's a community of some kind, right? And in particular, there was a kind of excitement among early Co-op City residents that architectural kind of critique among, people who were, in general wealthier, more, established, whatever, like that they were sort of missing the actual desires of the people that moved in. And so that is kind of where that's the kind of that's one of the big controversies. Now there's a secondary controversy that's particular, I'll mention for people in this audience. So, Co-op City, as you know, is right next to, Baychester and, Deer Pelham, whatever. It's in the same planning district where you had actually, well-established middle class, actually demographically in some ways very similar community, albeit of people that own single family homes. And they were afraid of what to some degree kind of happened, which is that they would suddenly be overwhelmed by this huge number of new residents. Most of the people that were living in the area beforehand, again, the white black demographics were actually pretty similar to Co-op City, but was more likely to be Italian, Irish. These are homeowners, they're Catholic, and then you have all of these what they saw as kind of like left-wing Jews, coming in. And there were concerns about overloading public transportation. In addition to that, just from a pure planning perspective, about the insufficiency of amenities to support this huge new population, and as well as conflicts around the schools, which are part of that story as well, which we can talk to you about later. So there are two other questions here, which I actually want to answer together. One of them, well, actually, I'll go with I was going to do it in one order, but I'll do it in the order they're here. The first question is, was there a large amount of turnover after the carrying charge strike? And yes, so in fact, this is how my family wound up moving in. My mother, I mentioned before, her entire family lived in Co-op City. They didn't. When I was born, they were living in Brooklyn. She hated it. Whatever, she wanted to move to Co-op, but there was no way she was going to get she thought that they'd be able to get a large apartment, but suddenly all these apartments opened up during the rent strike and in its immediate aftermath. And that's how they managed to get the apartment that they are still in today. And so, so there is this turnover, and that's actually part of the story of racial change in Co-op City in the late 70s and early 80s, is that in a sense, what happens is that by 1976, the wait list to move in is almost entirely Black and Hispanic. It's like 90%, I believe, in 76. But the resident population is wider, but as those people move out, and they're moving out in part because of the sense of turmoil around the strike and uncertainty, but then also, white flight has its own dynamics right after that. But as those people are moving out, then the people that move in and replace them are, the people on the wait list who are much more likely to be Black and Hispanic. And that's the story of Co-op City's racial transition, really in some ways starts with this, these move outs in the 70s. Okay, next question is about the emptying of the Grand Concourse. Okay, this is actually a really interesting story. So here's the story that you probably heard, if you know this, which is, as one person said, I couldn't find, all right, I found this quote, but it was I couldn't use it for a variety of reasons. Someone said that the Co-op City operated like a giant vacuum, sort of sucking up all of the sort of middle-class Jews in the concourse and sucking them up and bringing them to Co-op. Now, here's what's right. There's some of that's right. I mean, the fact is Co-op City, some astonishing percentage, I think it's there's two different zip codes that make up the neighborhoods around the concourse, and something like about 10% of those two zip codes those residents would move to Co-op City. And indeed, this is the story of my mother's family. They lived in these small apartment buildings sort of near the concourse, and then they all moved in, kind of en masse. There was there was a department store on the concourse that is no longer in existence, and I forget the name of it now, but it had an entire model Co-op City apartment with all the furniture you could have for that apartment, as part of the, the way it was set up or whatever. Okay. Here's where that story winds up being a little, and we just want to complicate it in a few ways. One is that, this story about the Grand Concourse was indeed an exclusive place to live at one point. That had already started to change in the 50s and 60s as basically redlining and exclusive covenants that had kept Jews from being able to move into the suburbs, get relaxed after World War II. More and more middle-class Jews leave urban, Jewish enclaves, like the Concourse area in the West Bronx, for those areas. The Jews that were living in the Concourse by the mid-60s tended to be older, and they tended to be poorer than the Jews who were in the Concourse like a decade or several decades earlier. In fact, think about the architecture of the Concourse, right? It's 20s architecture, it's fabulous, like Art Deco architecture, right? You don't see quite as much being built even in the 50s, but certainly by the 60s. If you talk to anyone who moved to Co-op City, whether they moved from the Concourse, whether they were white, whether they were Black, whether they were Hispanic. I mean, I talked to a lot of people in writing this book, and almost universally, in fact, I dare say universally, what I heard people say was that they moved to Co-op City because they felt like their neighborhood was in decline. Now, obviously, that rhetoric of decline has like racial overtones. I don't want to, in any way say that that wasn't the case, but it's also a rhetoric that you see across people of, making across racial dynamics. And it's this interesting thing where, on the one hand, you have these people leaving a neighborhood, which is, in fact, often the very same people are leaving a neighborhood in part as it's becoming more Black and Hispanic and also poorer at the same time, but moving to a neighborhood where they're talking about how great it is that it's this like multicultural, amazing space. And that was a sort of paradox or something that I really spent a lot of time thinking through in writing the book. And I spent a fair amount of time, it's a sort of through line in the book, is thinking about that question, or just in general, the sort of racial demographics of Co-op City. What happened to Charlie Rosen? Well, there's a few different answers to that. He actually, you're right, he would in some ways be a natural for electoral politics, and he was asked to run. In fact, he's involved in taking down key figures in the sort of East Bronx Democratic Party machine at the time of the rent strike. There's this great, there's a few really good stories, and they're in the book, but one of them is like involves him like wearing a wire to bring down like Abraham Hochberg, who's like promising him like patronage jobs and all this stuff. But he was asked by the sort of new Democratic club that comes in after that to run for Congress, and he turns them down. In fact, that's Elliot Engel, or no, first to run for assembly, which is then they turn to Elliot Engel. That's how Elliot Engel gets involved in electoral politics, is because Charlie Rosen didn't want to do it. I think he wasn't that in some ways at the time, and he was almost like too far left to really want to be involved with, certainly with the Democratic Party in some ways, but also really with electoral politics in general. I mentioned I was from college. I mean, I grew up like the daughter, like he has 3 daughters. I have 2 sisters. We actually all grew up together in the same, townhouse complex. So I've known Charlie Rosen literally as long as I can remember. And, through most of the time I was growing up, he seemed like this, like, he was involved in sort of running Co-op City for a while. He stepped back from that, but he's always kind of involved in one way or another. And then, years later, there was a patronage scandal. I don't know that many of the details. When he was involved with a nonprofit in the mid 2000s, where he wound up being involved with some fraud. And now he's just, still lives in Co-op City, still has his apartment there, but is, not in, he's quite old now, and no longer really involved in public life in quite the same way. But I will say, he was one thing that was great about when you're doing historical research, a lot of it is like pretty dry, a lot of the things that you read, government reports and, newspaper articles detailing like corruption scandals or whatever, it can get pretty dry. Every time I read something that was like Charlie Rosen's words, it were always like so kind of vibrant, and it was great to read, honestly. I mean, he was a really great communicator in a lot of ways, both at the time, but he continued to write publicly really for about a decade afterwards. And that was always like fun to read. Oh, I love reading these remembrances. Robert C. Okay. The pile. I would love to see a picture of the helicopters bringing air units to the schools. That's classic. So there were handball courts elsewhere. I'm not sure there are other tennis courts. Oh, thank you for downloading the book, Michael Rocco. Anyone else wants to? I'll be very. One thing I just want to say, we don't have a huge amount of time left, but while we wait for other questions, and certainly feel free to ask them, I am very easy to Google. I think there's like another Anne-Marie Sammartino out there, but like she's like a nurse or something. You'll figure out who I am pretty quickly. Send me an email. I would really love to hear from anyone. If you have stories, if you have memories you want to share, if you have questions you want to ask that we don't have time to ask here. I really, in writing a book like this in part was, because I was interested in the story, but also because I feel like a lot of times people don't tell, like, professional historians, academic historians, as I am, don't always tell the story of just like what I feel like in some ways the most important stories for historians to tell, which are the stories of like real people and real communities that don't necessarily always fit, the sort of big historical narratives, and don't necessarily feature like sort of, quote unquote, big, important, often wealthy, privileged, narratives or whatever. And so like, that's meant that I've really enjoyed getting a chance to go talk to community groups like this, but also that I really do love like engaging with people and really hearing what your stories are. Sometimes, they match up with the kind of historical record that I've found, but often, they're sort of idiosyncratic and interesting, because of that. So thank you.
Great, great presentation. I would appreciate your time. Do you have any other books on the horizon that you're working on, or?
Great question. It's funny, you write a book and then you're just trying to, like, right now, the thing I'm thinking about is quite far from this, which is, I'm thinking about writing a book of intellectual history, actually looking at the 18th century and how Enlightenment philosophers think about the idea of self-fashioning and risk. So that's my new sort of fascination. But this topic does remain sort of near and dear, and so I'm done, a number of, I'm thinking of doing some like public history initiatives, kind of to get this story out there to broader audience in the Bronx. I don't think that will necessarily result in another book. I think I may be done with my Co-op City books, but it's definitely a history I'll always cherish.
Well, like I said, we definitely appreciate it, and I think you are now the go-to person for Co-op City in its present form. So we're definitely appreciative of that. So thank you so much for your time, and for, like I said, get the book. I guess barnesandnoble.com, Amazon, or Kindle. It's out there. It's in hardcover. So please, by all means, everyone here, or remaining 30 people who are here, at a good crowd of 40 people at one point, but definitely please get the book. And we definitely appreciate your coming out and presenting to us, Anne-Marie. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
Take care now.
It's really a pleasure.
Thank you.